Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and I am here with Diana Butler Bass, and we're going to maybe ruin your morning coffee.
Here's mine.
I actually I just finished mine, so now I just have water. I just have water because I knew, if if I drank this morning, considering what's on the docket of the "We Are So Overwhelmed" edition, the rest of the day might go downhill, Diana.
Oh, I know. That's actually why I have coffee. So I'm trying to keep focus because there's so many things that are out there demanding our attention right now. So that's one of the reasons I feel overwhelmed.
Yeah, well, it is I think there's a deep commitment from a whole lot of people shaping our existence to make sure that we can't go through a day and just assume moderate competency and integrity and stewardship of the most powerful knobs our humans have. So there you go. Isn't that
Yeah.
exciting?
Well, it's funny because I'm on this sabbatical, partial. I call it my partial sabbatical. So I'm still writing and I'm still doing some stuff, digitally, like with you, and I guess we'll have some news on that uh,
We could
upcoming.
hint it to them at the end.
Yes, we
Yeah,
can.
well, it'll be a lure as long as someone reminds us.
Stay
Some
till the end. So I'm doing some things like that, which are relatively easy in terms of there's no travel involved, and so that's my main sort of sabbatical commitment is that I'm not traveling for work. I'm doing other kinds of traveling that I want to do that benefit my own growth and my grounding. And the writing that I'm doing is the cottage, but I'm not taking on any projects that are demanding projects. Somebody comes to me and says, "You must write this essay." It's like, nope, sorry, that's not happening. And I'm writing in my journal. I'm reading a lot of poetry, things like that. So I'm on this sabbatical ish time. Uh, and one of the things I realize is that it creates all this other space that people are trying to fill with this sort of loud, noisy, horrible, scary vacuum, a scary sort of noise machine of all this stuff that we've been talking about. So here I am on one hand sitting in my own house with a very clean office, and yet I'm feeling overwhelmed, which is weird. I should be feeling rested and happy because I spent the morning reading David White poetry. But instead, we're going to talk about Donald Trump thinking he's Jesus Christ.
Well, I actually was thinking, I know you just aren't down for people giving you projects, but have you considered um selling a Bible and and but in it you get to pick a few random other documents to stick in it. But the key is you have to pick one that you haven't read, aren't interested in abiding by, and utterly problematize the fact that it's stuck in with all of Scripture. So, like hypothetically, let's imagine you weren't a big fan of democracy, or really like laws, and you lacked integrity, and so you said, "Well, obviously, I should hand out a Bible." But then in it, you pick lyrics of some song that you don't like. Well, you technically like it, but you're not going to take it seriously. Then you have to put in like two random documents that the only time you've really probably used them is for toilet paper. And see, like that game, Diana, was fun when like Donald did it, and he was like, "Well, let's put the Constitution
We
and
should,
stuff."
that's right in there in the Bible, right in the pages.
Yeah, I was like, that's not the most Protestant thing of all time. Uh,
Well, you know what it reminds me of in some ways? At the end of the last century, beginning of the century, there was the publication of the Schofield Reference Bible. Not this century, the one before. So the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century, there was the publication of the Schofield Reference Bible. And that Bible, put basically all the dispensationalist charts in the Bible. And before that, Protestants had a Bible that contained Bishop Ussher's 17th century timeline of all of world history. And that Ussher's timeline went into innumerable Bibles published throughout Western history in the basically the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. And that chart, Bishop Ussher's timeline of world history that went in all these Bibles, showed that the earth had been created in 4004 BC.
Obviously.
Yeah. And so this is a thing actually where Protestants do take other documents and stick them in with the Bible. And when they do that, often those documents become the sort of interpretive grid through which a certain group of Protestants begin to sort of see. I mean, that's what those things are there for, is to provide a window so that you know how to see scriptures. They're interpretive aids. So they're like a pair of glasses that you hand out with the Bible. And so in effect, some of these Bibles that are produced now are the same way, but this one's particularly interesting because it's an American Bible. And so they want the Bible. They want you to read the Bible itself through the lens of Christian nationalism. And they think that by putting these particular documents and this particular music and all this stuff in relationship with this Bible, it's going to help you read the Bible correctly. And to all of our friends in Canada, the UK, Australia, Germany, France, all the people who are listening to us, sorry, we get the Bible here in America for ourselves. And you guys just have to come along for the ride because there's clearly no way that God is as interested in all your other countries as God is in ours. We're the key to hermeneutical history.
Well, that's good. That's good. I like maps.
What about that? This is something Protestants actually do.
I like maps but I like mostly maps of Middle Earth. I think that really helps when reading.
Oh my gosh.
As you
That'd be
where
fun to
things are.
replace all those maps of Paul's journeys and Bibles from the National Council of Churches printed up Bibles with maps of Paul's journeys and all sorts of other kinds of maps in them in the mid 20th century. Can you imagine if they had all been printed up with maps of Middle Earth instead?
Yeah, well, at least there's not maps of America, and you just you just change the names of all the letters of Paul. It's like, well, he's really, really angry writing Galatians, so that's probably to Los Angeles, cesspool of liberalism. He's really happy in Philippians, so he's hollering at Alabama.
Well, speaking of change of maps, have you seen what that meme or that tweet that's going around Twitter, and also it's a posting on Facebook where some group of fundamentalist Christians produced a map of the eclipse?
Oh yeah.
It started
Well,
how the eclipse was going to start in Jonah, Texas, and then move across something like
it's gonna touch all the Nineveh cities,
yeah, 8
half of which
cities.
aren't real.
8 cities in North America called Nineveh, ending up exiting North America over Nineveh, Nova Scotia, and, th they manipulated the map. I mean, one thing, it was really surprising to me that there are that many cities called Nineveh in North America. I mean, what were people thinking?
I
You know?
And then they had like a book that's just like cities in the Bible, or maybe that's what it was. They had a Bible with a map in it, and they didn't know any of the stories, so they were just Nineveh. It's in the Bible, so it has to be good.
It's cool.
Yeah, it's right next to Sodom, and oh,
Oh my gosh. So anyway, so manipulation of maps sometimes has happened. And we've got this thing about the eclipse. But anyway, they manipulated the NASA map so that they actually moved the trajectory of the eclipse, that it would go over all these cities so that they could make this apocalyptic
mhm.
or eschatological point. And that's where I mostly saw it, was the few crazy right-wing people who are in my larger web of existence. They've all been posting it eagerly. Look at what's going to happen on April
Oh,
8th. Oh my gosh, get ready. It's like there's going to be an eclipse and it's going over Columbus, Ohio.
Well, did you know with a Sharpie, you can just redirect hurricanes too. So, just move it on over here and
There you go. So so anyway, this is kind of a thing. We got off on the Bible tangent, but it does lead to this apocalyptic tangent of Tuesday. People expecting the end of the world, and it's like, honest to goodness, this is the 21st century. Hello. Hello. But then the state of West Virginia just passed a law yesterday, or at least it passed one of their state houses. I don't know which one, probably their lower house, where they are now going to teach creationism as a substitute for science, for secular science. And so
what?
congratulations to the 21st century. You reverted to the
Oh,
12th. Um, so
ugh.
apparently maps and trajectories and Noah and all these things, you know, they or the National Weather Service in America, NASA, nothing, none of this matters anymore. Um, and in place of it, what you get is, frankly, you never hear me say this, but I'm going to say it, a bunch of freaking yahoos who have decided that their opinion matters more than facts in every sort of realm of life. And if you live in West Virginia, I'm really, really, really sorry for the fact that you are in a beautiful state that is run by people who are legitimately nuts. And I mean, this is someone who is writing a novel's worst nightmare of what democracy would wind up being. Uninformed, illiterate kooks making laws by which the rest of us normal people, who function according to actual sort of ways the universe works, are going to have to live our lives. And if that isn't just the worst possible outcome of people reading the Bible for themselves and we the people making a nation, I don't know what is, except if you put up a political candidate who thinks he's Jesus Christ. I mean,
Whoa, who would do
that's
that?
that is just like, oh, this is the overwhelmed Diana. This is what happens when I'm overwhelmed. I'm sorry.
Well,
I really
the
love
West
all of you,
Virginia,
but this is
that's
just, it's too much for me. I can't be calm right now.
well, yeah, well, there's a sense that, um, Plato is right about democracy. I think that's what they're invested. Plato's critique of democracy in the Republic is like, are you really sure you wanna let everyone have input? It's like, have you met him? And, I mean, he's the Republic is like Socrates is the character, for him. And Socrates runs around just trying to demonstrate his own ignorance, right? Like trying to problematize the reality that, oh, he's the smartest man around. And but when it gets to critiquing democracy, like part of it is like he's like, yeah, but I get the idea of it,
Mhm. The
and it makes
theory is
sense.
great.
It's one of those things that makes perfect sense if you think reason is more effective than it really is. But it's not the only horse pulling the chariot, my friend. And there's a whole bunch of others, right? Like where like the deepest passions and like your own prejudice and these kinds of things. Then what happens? What does reason end up doing? It ends up using its power to do what? Go where, like, create a justification for where your desire, your animus, your all these other instincts want you to go.
Yeah.
And that's something that has proved true, the more we know in current psychological research is that oftentimes our reason isn't used to force us to be critical or to reflect, is to come up with elaborate justifications so that our our biases, our prejudice, our whatever, what you want to be true, now gets to be. And there in Plato's whole in the Republic, there's this, like, there's the initial version of it, right, where there's contesting and it puts limits on it. But then he goes, well, what happens when the populace is you get critical mass for a delusion? Then the reason is there to steward the power well towards your own ignorance and destruction.
And
And
that
that's
and I mean, that's not even theology. I mean, that's ancient philosophy, and that's just right. And what we clearly have right now is that that the energy has shifted not towards a majority of the populace. I mean, this isn't even democracy in that sense. It's a big minority group, and the delusion has taken completely hold. And I the way in which I remember years ago when a whole bunch of us were involved in the emergent conversation, and there was this moment and sort of emergence leadership where the Christian emergent types met with the Jewish emergent people. And that was a really interesting conversation. And it's shaped my thinking for years, in part because someone from the Jewish community who was involved in creating new sorts of synagogues for the future was friends with the guy who was the owner of Home Depot. And they had sat down with this guy, and they said, "You know, what how did Home Depot get so big? You know, how did you become the company that you are?" And the owner of Home Depot told them that you don't have to control the whole market. All you have to do is get a 10% share. And once you have a 10% share of the market, then the market changes. And I've never forgotten that. And it works politically, and it works in terms of creating institutional change. It works economically, and it certainly, I think, has worked for this whole MAGA Trump phenomenon, is that once you get a 10% share, and they have probably 20% true believer share, you just make the whole rest of the thing respond to you. And a delusion that's believed by 20% of the American people, I mean, that's a huge delusion.
Yep.
Yeah.
But I think we were going to talk about political idolatry first.
Well, I
You
think
know,
we kind of are.
yeah. Well, I know. I just yeah. I realized I derailed things at the very beginning, just because you never know when you get to do a little recounting of Plato dialogues.
I loved that. I really appreciate it. I think that's really
And there's a couple of people
valuable.
in the chat that brought up, yeah, the Jonathan Haidt uses the image of the rider on the elephant as an example for how moral reasoning works, which is a update of Plato's the charioteer and the horses in the Republic. But yeah, anyway, political idolatry, Diana.
Well, yeah, I wrote about it yesterday and I sent a piece out last night. I wasn't really planning on sending a post out to my whole community last night, but I wound up doing it because what happened over Easter was really disturbing. On Easter Sunday,
Like the conquering of sin, law, and death.
well, that part I
Oh, okay.
liked.
I'm just making sure. I've heard about you on Twitter. Sometimes you don't really believe in anything. And
I went to a wonderful church service on Easter Sunday at Founder United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. Great church. So anyway, I heard a good sermon, great music, fantastic.
and
Um,
I got tons of messages about the conversation we had with Dom, with people who are like, "Oh, yeah, that's exactly what. Like, I get what y'all are talking about by the resurrection." They were like, "That was like an hour and a half long Easter sermon where I think I understood why I like it so much." I get a number of messages. So people miss that. You should go check it out.
yeah, oh, that was great. It really shaped my celebration of Holy Week and Easter too this year. So anyway, all that was fantastic. But the other thing that was happening was and I didn't pay attention to this. I wasn't sitting on social media. I was doing my Easter stuff with my family. But I got home and just saw in passing that Trump had tweeted a lot that day. And the next morning, I woke up and was watching the news programs, and lo and behold, on Easter Sunday, Donald Trump tweeted 77 times. And it was just this barrage of hate and threats and delusion with a capital D, about his affinity with and identification to Jesus Christ, including retweeting an article called The Crucifixion of Donald Trump. And it was an astonishing display of madness. I mean, remember the old movie, The Madness of King George? One day somebody's going to make this into a film. And so people were talking, I mean, everybody was talking about it. This tweet storm. Oh, it was on Truth Social, not Twitter. And so I looked up a whole bunch of stuff. I just sat there. I was just astonished. And all of a sudden then all the regular media started talking about how Trump, oh, Trump thinks he's Jesus. And I wondered, how long have you and I been talking about that, Trip?
Well, considering the first ruining dinner was during his first election, uh, I think we've been generally concerned about it since then.
Yes, we have been. And there have been people who are our friends, our personal friends who write books and articles and who have done just a ton of work in this. So there's been this very consistent, persistent group of Christian thinkers, authors, theologians, and pastors who have been warning about this for at least 6 years. And on Easter Sunday, it was just on full display, and it was like everybody in the media finally noticed, and they kind of all woke up to it. And the New York Times had published an article on Easter Monday called "The Church of Trump," and there was some piece in the Washington Post about Trump's messianic delusion. And so anyhow, that's what I wrote about. And, my piece, I thought, how can I write about this that just isn't crazy, alarmist, um, sort of the same old, or like the media, all this, or me saying to the media, "I told you so," which I kind of wanted to do, but I wasn't going to. The the piece, the other thing that I had done over Holy Week is that I watched some stuff about Moses and, Passover and the Exodus, including the cheesy old movie, about the that called The Ten Commandments, and the new
The new
Netflix.
Netflix one?
Yeah, have you seen
Yeah, yeah.
that?
Yeah,
It's
it's really
actually
good.
it's really good. And so I watched that and I was just transfixed by it. It was really fun to see some of our friends on that Netflix series. And I sat there and I thought, Pete Enns was one of the major scholars in the series. And he put out tons of stuff. I've never heard him say anywhere else about Moses. I'm sure he has in classes, but I said, I've never heard Pete, I've never heard you say this. I'm talking to the TV. And I kept yelling to Richard, "Hey, Pete Enns is on TV and he's saying great stuff about Moses." So anyway, I was watching that whole thing, and both of those shows, they get to the sort of the penultimate moment of Moses's career, and it's, he's got the 10 commandments and he comes down the hill, and what does he see? He sees the Hebrew people at the base of the mountain worshiping a golden calf, having a wild orgy. And so Moses gets angry, God gets angry, God threatens to destroy the world all over again. It didn't work the first time, so I'm going to make it happen this time. And Moses, of course, pleads for the people, and some other stuff happens, and God decides that he's going to forgive the Hebrews, but they wander for 40 years in the wilderness. So anyway, I was thinking about that account, and I had just read it. And I can tell you with some honesty that I've never, or haven't read the whole of Exodus 32 in a very long time. And the presentations in the film and in the series, as scary as they are, um, don't even begin to match the horror of Exodus 32 as it's written in the Bible. And I urge people, go and read Exodus 32 and how seriously the God of Abraham and Sarah, the God of Moses, the God of Jesus takes idolatry. This was it is an actual terrifying text to read. I'm sure it's in Phyllis Tribble's Text of Terror, because if it's not, she missed one of the most important ones. So anyhow, I was reading that, and it just really struck me that one of the things that we've got going on right now is a politics of idolatry. And it is absolutely the case that a significant number of Christians have set Donald Trump up as a savior, if not the savior. And that the language, and this is one of the things the more secular articles have pointed out, is that the language is very theologically slippery. And there really is apparently a belief in the substitutionary atonement theory of Donald Trump. And that is, Donald Trump has been put up in the place of all of the people who feel despised and persecuted and unworthy and unloved. And that Trump is standing there in their stead, taking the violence, the slings and arrows of Satan, the Democrats, the corrupted courts, all of the people who are out to get Trump. We're all Pharaoh and the empire, and Trump's friends, people whom he calls his friends, his voters. Those are the persecuted, oppressed people of Israel, and that Trump is their sacrifice, that America will be purified by Trump's blood, by Trump's crucifixion. That was a serious article, the crucifixion of Donald Trump. It was not in a liberal paper making fun of it. It was in the Washington Times, which is one of the most conservative pro-Trump serious newspapers in America. And so, I mean, literally seeing substitutionary atonement theory played out in Trump's own self-understanding in these 77 tweets, and of course in recent speeches. Robbie Jones wrote a beautiful, amazing piece about Trump's speech before the National Religious Broadcasters Association, that took place in the last week of February. So that was a proclamation, essentially, of his saviorship, his messianic mission. And so there it was. And if it was just the media making fun of this, or just some tweets on Truth Social, or even just, some analysts like Robbie Jones, who's really pretty dispassionate in many ways, that would be sort of one thing. But there were tons of interviews and clips with Trump voters. And this is one thing that I know that you and I have talked about and seen over these last couple years, is this increasing sort of theological dimension of language and interpretation among Trump's voters towards the MAGA movement. And the Trump voters themselves were saying things like, well, Jesus was wounded for us. And so and there was this one woman who said, so in my brain, that just immediately connects with what Donald Trump is doing. And Donald Trump is being wounded for us. And this is the only way that America will be healed. And she literally articulated the substitutionary theory of the atonement, vis-a-vis Donald Trump and this election in this American guise. And that, my friends, I mean, every Christian in the United States who has anything invested in this, I mean, frankly, every Christian around the world has something invested in this in some way, shape, or form. But particularly in our country, if you saw that and you're not standing up and saying that's heresy, it's heresy at the very least. it might be blasphemy, and I think it really is idolatry, but I can see that some people would say, I don't wanna go that far. But we're talking about the 3 of the biggest, baddest sins in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition: blasphemy, heresy, and idolatry. And we're not just saying it, they're saying it. And so it's, to me, I mean, if you're a liberal Christian and you can't say that, and you can't stand up in your church and say this is heresy, there's something that's really gone wrong.
Yeah, and I think that passage at the towards the end of chapter 32, um, where you I don't know what you'd call it, the eureka of where the golden calf came from, right? Um, uh, where Moses comes back, to Aaron and is like, "So where did this thing come from?" And they're like, "Well, you were gone, and we didn't know what to do, and I had to improv here, Moses. I didn't know, and so I just said to everyone, hey, if you got gold, take it off." And so they gave it to me, and I threw it into the fire, like good sacrifice or whatnot. And then boom, this calf came out.
I know. It's
This calf came
hilarious.
out. Like obviously it was a work of God because the calf just came out. We just put the gold in there, and you hear that kind of thing, and if you just read it, you'd go, I'm not too sure. I'm not too sure. Like when we were texting about it, I was like, yeah, it sounds like when you like come back in the living room and all of a sudden your walls have been markered up, and you look at your children and you're like, well, what happened? Well, so we were trying to clean up the markers and some of their lids fell off, and then there was this beautiful picture of a tree right
Just
there.
just happened. Just just showed up on the wall.
Yeah, eureka. It just boom. Wow. And I think that there's this the like even the inability, right, to even tell the ways that you were complicit in the building of the idol, right? Like that you render unto providence the actual fashioning of the idol is a wonderful description of what's happened in our American populace, where
Right.
there's just a whole bunch of people, and you can even play them clips, right? Like if you just go through so many of the senators, a bunch of the congressmen who aren't running again, and such, where it got to the point that nope, yep, their whole orientation is towards this golden calf, this reality, uh, but it's like they've managed to block out any agency they had in the whole thing, um, and and I don't think there's even a or I think one of the tendencies is for more progressive Christians and mainline Protestants in general to act like we're not a part of it,
Right.
right?
That's one of the things that I wrote
And to
about.
not even think about what responsibility there is, um, and what the obligations are. But you were talking before that we were talking before this about both of us. Jim Wallace was on Morning Joe and mentioned this the way in which uh, the 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 kind of silence and blindness or maybe not blindness but like a kind of silence being conscripted or compelled upon you is a struggle for lots of faith leaders.
Right.
And when and when you hear leaders unable to think about what to do, like that's a theologically significant thing to stop on.
Yeah. It really is. And so often I hear people, sort of making fun of, say, the senators. And the senators are just kind of, backing off all this passive language, this, that, and the other thing. Oh, they're going to people will get over this. It's just, this is temporary. I mean, or, Mitch McConnell actually said that with the January 6th thing and Donald Trump. Before January 6th happened, Mitch McConnell said, oh, he just kind of thinks he didn't lose the election. Just we have to let it sink in a little bit. Once it sinks in, it'll be fine. And that's in a sense, that's the kind of thing that I feel like I've heard, not from everyone. I know lots of incredible, brave, pastors in this time period, people who actually lost jobs often. But the majority of what I hear is more along the lines of someone in private saying, "Oh yeah, Donald Trump is terrible. I'm horrified by this. I would never vote for this man." You know, all of that. But then when they get in front of their congregation, it's the same thing. It's kind of a moving it into the passive and like, "Oh, I know there are many Republicans in this congregation, and we respect you, and, this is not really what you believe," and we y I mean, it's this quick backpedaling to try to preserve what they think is the unity of the church. And that's what the Republican senators have been doing. They've been trying to preserve the unity of the Republican Party. They've been trying to be good Republicans. And so in the same way mainline pastors are trying to be good, Lutherans or good Methodists or what have you. But what we've seen in the longer trajectory of Trumpism is that that doesn't work. Because what begins to happen is the institution doesn't reject the thing. Instead, the Republican Party has become Donald Trump. It's not like the Republican Party is one thing and this is a little blip. The Republican Party has become Donald Trump. And so when I see that, and I see this similar thing at work in so many mainline congregations, all I can say is, my friends, I have no words of hope for you if you are acting like a Republican senator. If you're trying to give space and you just say, "Well, that's not who they really are, and, they don't really believe this, they're just gonna vote that way because of taxes," or what have you, eventually, the ideology of the thing takes over the whole. And it's a subtle and weird process, and I can't say that I would have known it without what we've witnessed now, over the last few years. And, this is just insane. Someone just said that preaching politics threatens the church's nonprofit status, and that is sort of true. Um, Churches are not supposed to endorse particular political candidates. You cannot do that. You can't get up in a pulpit and say, "Vote for Joe Biden," or you can't get up in a pulpit and say, "Vote for Donald Trump." So that is technically forbidden by a whole bunch of these statutes, um, including what's the amendment? The Johnson Amendment that evangelicals want to get rid of. I have a couple things to say about that. The only people who follow laws are mainline Protestants. Um, Catholics do not follow that law. You cannot find a Catholic bishop who follows that law. And you cannot find an evangelical congregation that follows that law. So basically, mainline Protestants, we're all sitting there going, "Oh, it's 1957, and the law says you're not supposed to preach politics because it's against the law. So we're going to be really good, and we're not going to break the law. We're the only people not breaking the law." And you can see what good that is doing. Absolutely big fat zero. It does no good. And so that's a zero, not a white power sign. So it is doing absolutely no good at all to obey a law that everybody else is ignoring. Um, Especially when the law itself is a sort of a statute that's already been questioned. And it's so literally get that out of your brain. There are reasons to not preach partisan politics from a pulpit, but obeying the law is not one of them because everybody's breaking it. Um, I do think it's a bad idea to use pulpits to be the places where pastors say vote this way. I do think that partisan politics like that is wrong. But that's not all politics is. You can get up in your pulpit and say that Donald Trump is committing blasphemy, and maybe that should have something to do with the way you vote. And that is not going to land you in jail. It's not going to get rid of your tax status. Nothing. You're preaching theology at that point. You're not preaching politics. And so that's what mainline pastors have to get their brains around. How can you preach theologically about political questions that don't devolve into partisanship that is admittedly questionable from church pulpits? And honestly, if you got some compunction about the Johnson Amendment and you really want to keep it, it's not breaking the law to get up and saying that Donald Trump is a blasphemer. That's just saying the theological truth of the matter. Is that was what my piece was about, was to try to encourage people, and you and I are going to do some more work around this, is to try to get people to understand that we must preach theologically about this political moment. And that's different than preaching partisan politics from a pulpit. Even though it's going to sound the same to some of your congregations, you've got this little teaching job ahead of you to teach them the difference between those two things. Just the same way I just taught in this circumstance, that it is questionable and weird territory about partisanship from a pulpit. Yes, absolutely. That could possibly get you in trouble with the IRS, but it doesn't get Catholics and evangelicals in trouble with the IRS. So you've got that set of questions, but then you've got this other set of questions. If a major presidential candidate of the United States for the United States presidency of the United States of America is proclaiming his own messiahship, and his people are talking about like he's the substitutionary atonement of God for the sins of America, you better be preaching that, because that's the central message of Christianity, and Donald Trump is corrupting it to your congregation as we are gathered here.
The question of idolatry in this situation, I think, is helpful. And I mentioned, I think last time when we were on here, being in the middle of Jeff Pugh and I doing a big project around Bonhoeffer, and like the breakdown there, way before like the Nazis are in complete power and such, was the question of idolatry in the church. And there were two elements of the way that ideology took root in the church that became like the kind of like the turning point. One was the Arian paragraph, right? So at that point, the relationship between the church and state's real different there, because you have state churches, even though they're connected to different, like the Reform side or the Lutheran and Catholic Church. But because tax money would go to clergy and things, then the question was whether or not once that you weren't going to have workers for the state, right? That weren't pure Aryans. Like, are we going to allow that? Like, if someone's ethnically Jewish and converted in their clergy, do they get kicked out? What if you have mixed race families, right? Like all these kinds of questions. And the initial response from the critics, which was much more popular initially, right? Was what? No, like your baptism is your identity in the church. And so like it's obvious, like, yes, we're a part of the German people as Germans, but like our identities in our baptism, right? And so like the ones that the Arian paragraph was utterly problematic, the ones that got involved in the ecumenical movement and confessing church and moves towards resisting. And over time, like as the culture capitulated and it started to be enforced elsewhere, then the percentage of people that existed in the moderate lean against the Arian paragraph all slowly accommodate, because culture is accommodating.
That's right.
And they become a bystander. And this is something in one of my favorite books of late, Victoria Barnett's book, Bystanders, Conscience and Complicity During the Holocaust, is she goes, the narrative you tell yourself as a bystander. is, well, I'm not on the aggressor's side. I'm not on the villain side. Um, I'm like, I'm not involved. Like I'm out. This is not my thing. And she goes, yeah, but if you look at the dynamics, the bystander is permitting the persecutor. Unless you identify with the victim, then you're in a permissive state. And what happens as more people uh, tell themselves they're a bystander, they start bystandering, right? And so she argues that bystander is not like a noun; it's actually a verb. It's an activity you're engaged in,
And
and
that
the
you actually create more of when you engage it?
right. Yeah, yeah,
Wow.
yeah. Like by standing, right? Like thinking like I'm not involved in this. This is political. It's not connected to my faith or whatnot. That over time, what happens is culture starts to shift. Then the power of culture, like by inertia, just kind of sucks you in. But if you ask yourself, like, what whose agency are you enabling? It's it's the aggressor towards the victim. So like even if you're on the outskirts, or it started with, well, yeah, but they're a good Jew. Well, but you know what you've already done once you say they're a good Jew. You've made abstracted that category. You've implied the judgment works other places. So you just watch the shift in the life of the church. So that Arian principle, and how that Arian paragraph in kind of the change of the German state was one. The other was the Führer principle, and this is something, where, and you can see it, where this culture of resentment and all this, uh, the post World War I anxiety of economic, all these kinds of things are sitting there. Hitler harnesses it and says, like, I'm the solution. I am your retribution to the rest of Europe. I am the one who will bring Germany out of this culture of decadence that the liberal elites have been doing, and they're all mingling with these socialists. And this is his rhetoric. It finds root first in a rural area for those that are economically most exploited by the world at post World War II consensus. But the Fuhrer principle was like the solution is an authoritarian leader, that the people need a leader, the Volk need a figurehead, right? And Bonhoeffer, he does a sermon, radio sermon, right after the kind of installation of the Fuhrer principle. It gets cut off in the middle of it. They don't know exactly why, but
I never knew that.
yeah, and in it, he just said, here was his answer. You may be attracted to it because the reality on the ground for the working poor who are being exploited by the post World War I consensus, the cultural fear and resentment, the demands of change, the growing. There was crazy inflation, like so much you got paid 3 times a day because it wouldn't be worth it, and someone from your family would get the money and go buy food because if you got paid at the end of the day, you wouldn't anyway. Like it was a horrible situation. But his point was like the reality on the ground. You think the solution is an authoritarian who
Right.
performs your resentment and anger, and he goes, that is idolatry. So we don't have all that radio address because it got cut off, but he did 2 talks not long after that. We have the text from, and so the Fuhrer principle, he said, is Bonhoeffer is like it's you're unable to do it if you trust your baptism. Like if Jesus is Lord, who was Jewish, and these kinds of things, but you could never, like the referent that you run to and then follow in times of anxious change, threats, and frustration is your Hebrew Lord. It is not someone who settles the problems with violence, and like embodies in these horrible, perverse ways to the rest of your neighbors your resentment, right? And so, to like spending so much time doing this for this project, y'all all get to experience towards the end of the year. Um, the when you ask the idolatry question, and then having spent time reading both Bonhoeffer stuff, but also these other clergy in the time, the debate was, right, like, is this ideology taking over at the cultural level? Are we going to tolerate it, moderate it, or permit it in the church? That's the Arian paragraph.
Mhm.
Um, and the more you tolerate it, and the more you try to avoid
Right.
talking about it directly, the more people that get sucked into it, especially the lay people who then clergy are in the situation we're talking about. And the
Right.
other is that idolatry, like if the solution is the authoritarian who can name the problem and say that they're the solution, He's like, that's idolatry all on its own. Like, that's just idolatry. And so, like, I think that we don't know how to ask that question for similar reasons. Not that there's like pure parallels between the two, but it's one of those, like, sometimes at a distance you can learn things from looking at another historical period. And I think that distance allows us to go, yeah, sometimes our rationalization and processing of the present will describe us into a moment where we're on the good side, but never demand us to enact that good in particular ways. And what happens when you don't? You get that, like, shifting of a culture, and an ideology starts to take over institutions and then leverage that power, be it a political party or an economic system and these kinds of things. And that's but it's striking to me, like Bonhoeffer and Barth both very explicitly, like, the issue is idolatry. Um, and
That's
and then that it's wisdom for the present.
Yeah, and I don't think that it ever stood out to me quite so clearly as it did this Easter, this Holy Weekend, this Easter. Is that, I've always known there was theological issue with it. And, there were times I sort of made jokes that it was idolatry, but for some whatever theological or personal reason, of my own journey, um, this week it just became shockingly clear to me what the problem of idolatry is politically, and that Donald Trump has crossed that line. And this is where the church has the power and the mandate to speak out. And if we don't, then we're actually participating in idolatry, and we are essentially, standing there at the base of Sinai. uh even if you're not, if you're standing on the edge and saying this is terrible, there's an orgy going on, or I never would have made that golden calf, look, he just popped out of the gold, um however you sort of explain that away, um it becomes, you're a participant. And and there were that's actually part of the shock of Exodus 32, is you read through the chapter and God makes no distinctions. It got if somebody ran up to him, ran up to God and saying, "Hey, look, I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. We didn't do anything here. We were just standing on the side watching. It was really the Levites and this tribe and that tribe and the other tribe. And they were all doing it, but not my tribe. My tribe, we were trying to keep the peace." That didn't play. That did not play with Moses, and it didn't play with the Lord of the universe. Is that everybody who was there was found guilty. And that, I think, for me, was the part that was so shocking. I don't like to talk about, I mean, me, I kind of am allergic to talking about corporate guilt and sin, but there are things that we're corporately guilty and sinful for, and this, you, you can argue about some of them, but this one seems pretty clear, especially in the Bible, is that if you were there and you didn't stand up and say, absolutely not, we will go a different way, you don't take responsibility, I made the calf, you're jeopardizing the whole of the community at that point, and that everyone stands under judgment. And so it really made me feel like, that was the moment where I understood it's not just a joke. It's not just something we can let pass. It's not something that we should ignore because we're scared, or we don't want our congregations to break up, or there's a policy by the IRS or whatever you happen to try to do to avoid it. There's always a way to avoid responsibility for the golden calf. And if you do that, the judgment that is issued in scripture is unpleasant. I urge you, read the whole of Exodus 32. It's not just about getting banished in the wilderness. What happens before God sends them out 40 years in the wilderness is shocking. The Hebrews have to make another sacrifice to God to make up for the their worship of the golden calf before the 40 years wandering. And what they do in God's demand, and I don't think that God is demanding this of us right now in the same way. This is one of those difficult texts of the Old Testament. But what they have to do is uh, it'll make your eyes just pop out of your head. And that was the part I had forgotten. I just literally forgot that there was this absolutely brutal requirement of God in order to start the process of the cleansing of the idolatrous community. And that was it's well worth you thinking and praying through.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, I know we don't have a lot of time left here, Diana, and I'm glad we got to topic 1 on our list, here, but, um,
Oh, I
there
was just thinking real quick to end up the whole thing about
yeah.
bystanders. We don't even have to go as far as World War II. We can go to the 1960s
Mhm.
and think about Vietnam and what was going on with churches then, and what was also going on politically. And that's we get like Thomas Merton's Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander out of that set of political theological circumstances. That's really worth rereading. And then of course we got the what I would call the mini MAGA movement, which was around Richard Nixon and that whole political moment of the late 60s and early 70s in relationship to this really very similar set of questions. And I think that Nixon, he suffered only from megalomania, not necessarily full on theological idolatry and being a sort of a divine narcissist. Um, but yet, in a very real way, that set of events changed the trajectory of an entire generation's experience of life, democracy, economy, um, participation in global society and everything else. And so in effect that period is a lesser version of what happened in the 40s, and I think also a somewhat lesser version of what's happening now. But it serves as a model of um, what can happen when these things start going awry. And then mainline churches, some of them addressed it, and what happened was an analyst went back and said, "Oh, look, this churches started declining in 1972. Maybe that was because the churches were too liberal and they were talking about politics." But I've always wondered if the opposite wasn't true. Is that some churches addressed it, yes, and there were mainline pronouncements against Vietnam and for the civil rights movement, for example, but far more didn't do a thing. And or they fired ministers who tried to do something. And so what if it wasn't the fact that the churches spoke out against Vietnam that caused everyone to run away, but it was the fact that the churches refused to speak out against Vietnam that caused an entire generation of people to just give up on church and leave mainline churches. And that caused a generation plus of decline. So it wasn't that the church engaged politics, but it was that the church failed to engage the most important political questions in a way that was meaningful to people who are waiting for moral and social guidance at a very confusing time.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that one of the thing, and this is true about Merton, or if you're reading, like, Letter from a Birmingham
Yeah,
Prison,
very similar
MLK,
kind of document.
um, and you start to see these kinds of, there's a certain kind of reorientation to how you process the present. There's this passage in Bonhoeffer's, like, 10 Years After, which is his written not too long before he gets arrested, to his 3 closest friends that have all been trying to negotiate, what do you do when, and how do you think about it? And it begins with, like, this bit where he's like, "Well, we don't even have ground to stand on. Like, they're feeling both like complicit in all these ways, but then not knowing what to do and feeling really overwhelmed. And when he gets to the end and kind of after like doing this kind of challenge of idolatry, pointing out like, yeah, there's the aggressor, but there's also like stupidity is more a problem than malice. Like he has this beautiful reflection on it to go like, yeah, this is like once you get seized and people get seized, then what do you do? Because like evil has its own undoing, but stupidity, like you don't just like fix that. Like it generates its own justifications. And at the end, when he has this kind of observation that where he talks about the view from below. And for the longest time, I read this 10 years after piece as kind of like reading into it a lot of what he ends up saying later, not too long from prison. In the process of doing all this research for the fall, I realized he's at a monastery now. And at this monastery are 40 some individuals from Poland who are forced labor for the monastery. The German soldiers had arrested them, marched them there, and then the monastery asked for labor. And this includes like whole families.
Oh my.
Right. And so he's there going for this retreat, trying to figure out what to do next. And then he sees like he can't even go to a monastery to escape the sacrifices, the idolatry of Nazi control generates. That because this is the problem of idolatry, is it generates sacrifices. And so when you like in that context, he has this line at the end of like that it rereads all the way you think complicit. Like he's not like this hero. He's like an unfinished hero, and he's wrestling with his own place and what he does and the community he's in. He goes, it remains an experience of incomparable value that we have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below, from the perspective of the outcast, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed and reviled. In short, from the perspective of the suffering. And so that like once I put it in context, like realized what's going on at the world around him, not just in the macro, but even right, like the escape to a monastery. He's trying to connect ecumenical movement to do resistance and all this kind of thing in there, but he's being served by Jewish slaves essentially in a monastery. And there he's like, so now that is not like a critique of the other, it's a critique of him. Right. You may not be the one doing it. You may even be trying to undermine it in some way with whatever way you can, and you aren't sure if you're doing enough or too much or what you're supposed to do. But it's like end of this reflection after 10 years of after Hitler came to rise was here's the only thing I can really think of is that you can't do truthful, faithful reflection unless it's from the view of those suffering. And when I think of the present moment, you like, yes, that's a direct challenge, right, to certain policies that it's connected to Trump. But it's also, there are plenty of policies the Democratic Party is connected to we don't think of from the perspective of the suffering. But then when you go about the public conversation around politics, so much of it is from the perspective of the moderates who you hope to lure over just to vote for you on this one thing or something. The kind of pragmatic logic, he's sitting there going like, look where it's got me. It's got me riding a wave where I've managed to dodge forced service in a war. I don't know if we've accomplished much. And there's a Polish Jewish family serving me in my retreat to plan resistance. Yeah. And I think that kind of demand would mean like we should learn to ask that as mainline Protestants, where, it's not so much the challenges of upper middle class people, but what are the poor? How are they being impacted by the changes in public education and the ending of the child tax credit or these kind of things? What are the impacts of our economic and military industrial complex growingly? How is it? How do we think about it in relationship to the Palestinian children? Like you start going through these, and so that kind of desire not to offend, and not to raise the biggest challenges can lead people, I think here you see Bonhoeffer confessing, right? Like his own complicity in his resistance because he wasn't asking the questions from those that are suffering, but asking the questions of how can I have a semi-decent conscience in a time of deep complicity. And it's there at the end of this essay, right? Looking at being served by Nazi slaves made by Nazis from Poland, that he goes, nope, I think we need to ask from this perspective, from those that are suffering. And that will reveal idolatries deep and wide for all of us, that especially Americans in this time, and
Hmm.
and help us avoid the kind of, I think, the kind of I'm better than this person energy that Bonhoeffer's realizing in his own. Like, yeah, I was better than these people. They pieced out and didn't hold the line here or whatnot. Yeah, if you want to parse exactly how complicit you are on a railway of death, go for it. But he's like confessing in a sense that no, it's the view from below, those that are suffering, that speak it, right? And then so 2 years later in prison, that's when he says only the suffering God can help. We live
Right.
in a world where God's been pushed all the way out of the center, all the way onto a cross, right? These kinds of those lines that kind of generated a million books. They're like putting it in context and then asking it. To me, I read it in a deeply fresh way about, for me, being in the present, and like, what do you do? Like, are you always being pragmatic and negotiating lines as opposed to trying to speak in some kind of solidarity on behalf of and for those from below?
Yeah, and, in a very real sense, you could read that in a contemporary way as that's been the sociological, historical, and theological problem of mainline American Protestantism for a century. Um, and, you know, the whole idea that we were the church for the moderate middle. And it's constantly in this whole era of Trumpism, one of the things that I hear, out of people that I love and cherish. And everyone knows how much I have invested in these institutions and how much I appreciate these traditions. So this is not the voice of an outsider, coming at you. This is the voice of love from within the walls. And one of the things that just scares me is when I hear mainliners saying, "Well, we're not as bad as the evangelicals. Oh, look at them. 80% of them voted for Donald Trump and continue to support Donald Trump, or 80% of them won't say anything about idolatry." And then we say, but we are. Well, the statistics show that about half of us are. And who knows how loud we're being? I mean, half of the main lines, white main line, supports Donald Trump still, and that percentage went up between 2016 and the 2020 election. And so that is exactly what you're describing, right there, is that the moderate middle can compare itself to the worst thing, and then it feels better about itself and kind of gives itself a moral pass. We're not that bad. Um, and there, just while you were talking, my mind was kind of on fire because I thinking about this Exodus passage, and the idea of a sermon was sort of growing in my brain. But you said these words. You said idolatry always demands sacrifice, and that's exactly what happens in that Exodus passage. I mean, not to spoil the whole text, but the first thing that the Hebrews have to do in order to expiate their own sins in this horrible affair is the first tribe that comes running to Moses and says, "We're sorry," is actually the tribe of Levi. And so Moses then tells the Levites, and these are the people who become the priestly tribe. Um, he tells them that in order to make it up with God, they've got to go and kill their own fathers, brothers, neighbors, and friends. Is that they have to make a sacrifice of people they love, in order to make this thing go away. And so there's been this idolatrous sacrifice, and that creates this this moral horror where the people who are going to become the priests of Israel have to go and sacrifice actual people, human beings they love, in order to get out of the whole muddle for the entire community. And the text actually says they came back to Moses and 3,000 people were killed that day. And Moses says, God forgives you. And see, idolatry, I'm not, like I said, no one should ever take that literally and say, well, that demands that we go out and we kill the MAGA people or what have you. That's not what's happening here, is that the committing idolatry results in the murder of the thing that you love the most. And so that is, and then the tribe of Levi, of course, goes on to become the tribe of priests, and their priesthood is always functioning out of the horror of idolatry. What their ancestors had to do with their own hands to expiate the sins of that magnitude. And so, you can start putting that right into this whole thing of Hitler and Bonhoeffer and the theology that you're talking about. And the converse is true as well, I think, is that not worshiping an idol, but instead giving oneself in total devotion and love to one's baptism, to the true God, to the beautiful vision of Abba. Giving yourself over to that demands self-sacrifice. And so it's a willing sacrifice. It's not a sacrifice that's forced on you from the outside, to that is a sacrifice of blood, but instead the love of dedication, of commitment to, of cherishing this creator God, results in, so we give something up, and we don't know what that something is going to be, but that we enter into that willingly, that nobody's forcing it or demanding it of us, that love simply, it's just the moral expression of love and devotion. And so I think that you can read Exodus very much like that. You can read it as, okay, this is what happens when you make an idol of the wrong thing politically, because that's what they were doing. It was political idolatry in Exodus 32. They were putting a new god over Israel. And they're in the process of establishing a new community that's going to, move into a new land. And so it's legitimately what we're talking about with Bonhoeffer. It's legitimately what we're talking about with the civil rights movements. Legitimately, all those things. Um, it's a political theological text in that way, and if you do it wrong, it winds up in the worst horrors of bloodshed we can possibly imagine. But if you do it right, if you're even going with the right intention, I mean, literally, I think that God would have let Aaron off if Aaron would have just said, "Yeah, I did it. I'm sorry. I screwed up." I mean, Aaron was so caught up in this idolatry that he couldn't even admit his own involvement in it because he knew it was so morally reprehensible. And so, see, that whole text to me just speaks right to the situation that mainline churches are in right now. Is that we have to willingly sacrifice something for the love of our neighbors right now, for the love of the God in whose name we've been baptized, for the love of Jesus that we sing songs about on Easter morning, for the love of all humanity and creation. And so, what is that sacrifice? Well, maybe it's our institutions. You know, I don't know what it's going to be, but there is something that we are being called to do right now, and it's going to be a lot easier than whatever Israel was called to do in Exodus 32. And so this is a real moment of a theological political wake up call, I think, and all of the things that you bring up about Bonhoeffer are so salient and so spiritually, I think, relevant.
Yeah, it's well, this was intense. But
Well, we said we were overwhelmed, but it's helpful to talk about it theologically. I mean, who else? I mean, Richard and I talk about some of this stuff
yeah.
sometimes. We have been in relationship to the letter from Birmingham jail, which you brought up too. Um, but to be doing it in community and knowing how many people are listening to us who are struggling with the same thing is powerful. I
Mhm.
appreciate it.
Yeah. Um, well, for everyone that joined live, thank you for hanging out. And remember, if you are a member of the Cottage or the Homebrewed Community, you'll get the invites next time this happens. If you're a member of both, you'll get both invites next time it happens, but also probably an extra special blessing. I don't know how the Holy Ghost arranges it. For those of you that would love to hang out with us in person this October, you can come to Theology Beer Camp, theologybeer.camp, October 17th and 19th in Denver, Colorado. It's going to be a lot of fun. Brian McLaren's going to be there, and Ilya Dilio, and Jorg Rieger, and Grace G. Sun Kim. And it's going to be lots of fun. Bible for Normal People will be there.
It
And
ends.
yeah,
Woohoo! We can
so
ask about Moses and
yeah,
idolatry.
yeah, we should make sure we do that really late at night, right after we're like thinking about getting to bed and being like, so about Exodus 32.
I know. I literally thought about calling him on the phone because he's my age. We call on the phone. It's like, Pete, what about Exodus
Oh,
32?
oh, we're supposed to. We were going to give everyone a hint of what we're doing.
Yeah.
You should do that because I have my post-it here somewhere of our idea, but
Well, it's not unlike Theology Beer Camp in some way, shape, or form, but Tripp and I, along with Tim Whitaker of the New Evangelicals, we decided that instead of just making you worried and scared all the time, that we wanted to create a resource that can be used in congregations to talk about theology. So keep your eyes open because the three of us are putting together our communities and our imaginations and our hopes and dreams. And what we plan to do for the fall is to create a sort of a mini course that can be used in churches as well as for individuals, where we talk about Christian nationalism, what it is, but but we don't leave you there. We move on from there and say, hey, well, if that's Christian nationalism and that's what everybody's talking about, and people seem to think that's the only thing, what political options are available to Christians? How can we actually talk about politics theologically? And we're going to explore four very significant options for how people of faith can practice political theology in their own lives and in the world. And we were in the process of enlisting some of the very best people that are in our larger networks to talk about those things and do little mini lectures that you can take from the conversations that Tripp and Tim and I have, and literally show them for 30 minutes in a adult Bible study class in a church, and then have a great discussion about something like what Bonhoeffer really thinks about bystanding, or what Niebuhr would say to the war in Gaza. So that's the kind of thing that we're going to try to do, or we are going to do. It's going to take a little work. It's going to take a little while to get it to you, but we we really are committed to creating a religion and politics curriculum that can be used well in churches, and that isn't just about condemnation, but it's actually about learning how to practice our faith again in political and social settings.
mhm. Well, there you go. So we'll see you all soon. Next time maybe we'll do points 2 through 5, or in all likelihood there'll be a whole bunch of other things that happened since then that might inspire.
I know.
Uh,
It's just getting so bad. We're gonna have to have like the bulwark every day.
every day though.
Ruining dinners, coming to people. We need like a staff of a whole bunch more people to talk about this stuff.
Yes, though if someone is just independently wealthy with nothing to do, then you too can let us know because if we don't have to do everything, things can happen more frequently.
Oh my
The
gosh.
the yeah, one of the
Yeah,
things you learn
I'm
that
literally on a
technology is amazing.
group email with a whole bunch of people, and everybody else on the email has like a staff. And I'm
Yeah.
going, I have Richard, my my husband, and Tripp. See, Tripp and I do things together. I think it. No, I'm the staff.
Yeah. Well, this would be fun. And thank you all for hanging out. We will see you all again soon.
Yep, we love you.